You stolen my love, you now deserve.
People think it was just a hologram, but it wasn't. I've stood on stage for 50 years, and I've never felt anything like that night. When I reached out my hand, something reached back. I can explain the technology. I can explain the timing. But I cannot explain the feeling not there, not in London, not with Freddie.
The lights were already dimming when Brian May felt that quiet pressure in his chest that usually meant a memory was about to surface. The arena was loud, alive, impatient. Tens of thousands of people waited for the next song, unaware that something fragile was about to unfold right in front of them. Brian had played on the biggest stages in the world. He had survived decades of applause, chaos, and noise. But this moment felt different. He stood alone, guitar resting against him, listening to a silence that didn't belong to the crowd, it belonged to him. People would later say it was just a projection, just technology, just a clever stage moment. But standing there, Brian knew better. There was a strange weight in the air, like time itself had slowed down, like the past had leaned forward, curious to see if it would be acknowledged. Brian looked toward the darkened stage, not expecting anything and yet bracing for everything. Because some absences never fade, they simply wait. This wasn't about spectacle. It wasn't about nostalgia. It was about something unresolved, something Brian had carried quietly for years, hidden behind performances and professionalism. And when that presence finally revealed itself, the arena didn't erupt. It fell silent, not out of shock, but out of recognition. Because everyone felt it at the same time that something deeply personal was happening, and it wasn't meant to be rushed. But this moment didn't begin that night. It began decades earlier with a song that never stopped hurting. Before we continue, if you love the stories of Freddie Mercury and Queen and want to help keep his legacy alive, subscribe to this channel, like, and share. For Brian May, time hasn't softened everything. Some memories don't fade, they sharpen. There are songs he can play effortlessly, almost on instinct, and then there are songs that still demand something from him every single time, not technically, emotionally. Love of My Life is one of those songs. Brian has performed it hundreds of times, across continents and generations. Yet no matter how familiar the chords feel, the emotion behind them never settles into routine. Because the song is tied to a version of Queen that no longer exists, a version where laughter came easier, where loss hadn't yet rewritten the rules. For Brian, the song isn't painful because of how it sounds, it's painful because of what it remembers. It reminds him of long nights, quiet conversations, and moments that were never meant for an audience. It reminds him of things left unsaid, not because there wasn't time, but because no one ever imagines time will run out. He's spoken before about carrying a kind of silent guilt, not dramatic, not public, just the human kind, the feeling that there was always one more conversation to have. So when he steps onto a stage with that song, Brian isn't just performing, he's revisiting. And that weight never truly lifts. Which is why when London approached on the tour schedule, Brian knew this performance would be different. Because this time, the past wasn't staying quiet. It was about to step into the light. Love of My Life was never designed to fill arenas. It began as something intimate, almost fragile, shaped in quiet moments rather than grand ambition. Over time, it grew into one of Queen's most emotional centerpieces, but its core never changed. It remained personal, vulnerable, and inseparable from Freddie Mercury. When Freddie sang it, there was a softness in his voice that rarely appeared elsewhere. No bravado, no armor, just honesty, offered carefully, as if he wasn't sure it should be heard at all. After Freddie was gone, something unexpected happened. The audience took over. Night after night, Brian would play the opening chords, and thousands of voices would rise, not singing with him, but for Freddie. At first, it felt supportive, then it felt overwhelming. Eventually, it felt like a responsibility Brian never asked for but couldn't escape. He once joked that the crowd did the singing, so he didn't have to. But the truth was heavier. Those voices weren't filling silence, they were acknowledging absence. And Brian heard it every time. That's why the idea that emerged during tour planning unsettled him so deeply. The thought of Freddie's presence returning even symbolically threatened to collapse the careful distance Brian had learned to live with. It wasn't about fear of technology, it was fear of closeness. Because once you let the past stand beside you, it becomes much harder to pretend it's behind you. The suggestion came quietly during routine discussions. What if, during Love of My Life, Freddie could appear on the screen? Not as a gimmick, not as a trick, but as a moment carefully chosen footage, synchronized lighting, a presence meant to honor rather than imitate. To the team, it sounded meaningful, powerful, even healing. To Brian, it felt dangerous. He didn't reject the idea outright, he simply didn't respond at first. He studied the mock-ups, the timing notes, the technical explanations. All of it made sense on paper. That wasn't the problem. The problem was emotional proximity. Standing on stage alone with an acoustic guitar was one thing. Standing beneath an image of Freddie smiling, alive, eternal, was something else entirely. It blurred a line Brian had spent decades keeping intact. He wondered what would happen if he looked up and forgot, just for a second, that it wasn't real. Or worse, what if it felt real enough? Brian asked for time to think, time to test it privately, time to see whether he could carry that weight without breaking in front of thousands of people. Eventually, he agreed to a rehearsal. Not because he was ready, but because part of him needed to know. Because some questions don't go away unless you face them. And that first test would show him exactly how unprepared he truly was. Because seeing Freddie alone was already more than he expected. The arena felt enormous when it was empty. Without the crowd, the space didn't buzz with excitement, it echoed. Every footstep lingered. Every sound felt exposed. For Brian May, that silence was heavier than any applause. He walked onto the stage for the first technical rehearsal carrying only his acoustic guitar. No lights, no cheers, just the quiet hum of equipment and a few crew members watching from the shadows. This was supposed to be simple, a timing test, nothing more. "Whenever you're ready," someone said over the monitors. Brian nodded and strummed the first chord. The screen behind him flickered, grainy light, a brief distortion, and then Freddie. Not an imitation, not a stylized version, but Freddie Mercury as Brian remembered him, alive, playful, impossibly familiar. The posture, the expression, even the way he seemed to breathe between phrases. Brian's fingers stopped mid-motion. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. His shoulders stiffened, his breath shortened. For a split second, it didn't feel like rehearsal. It felt like interruption, as if something private had been opened without warning. "Do you want us to stop?" a technician asked. Brian didn't answer right away. He kept staring, searching for something he couldn't name. Then, quietly, almost reluctantly, he said, "Again." They ran it once more. This time, he played through the entire section. But when the image lifted its hand toward him, Brian couldn't move. The timing wasn't wrong. He was. And everyone in the room understood it. This was only a rehearsal, and it was already too much. By the time the show reached London, the O2 Arena was electric. Tens of thousands of voices filled the space, rising and falling with every familiar note. From the outside, it looked like just another triumphant night on tour. Inside, Brian felt anything but routine. He stepped onto the stage alone. The lights dimmed, shrinking the massive arena into something intimate. The first chord of Love of My Life rang out, and the crowd responded instantly, singing, crying, reaching for memories of their own. But Brian felt the seconds ticking louder than the applause. He knew exactly when it would happen. As the song unfolded, a subtle shift moved through the room. The audience sensed it before they understood it. The cheers softened, voices dropped. A strange stillness spread outward, like a breath being held all at once. Then the screen came alive. Freddie appeared not suddenly, not dramatically, but gently, as if stepping forward from memory itself. For a moment, the arena forgot how to react. Phones lowered, hands froze mid-air, and the silence arrived. Not shock, not confusion. Recognition. Brian kept playing, though his hands felt distant from him. He didn't turn immediately. He needed a moment just enough to steady himself before facing something he'd avoided for years. When he finally looked up, the crowd watched him instead of the screen. They saw it in his face before he ever touched his eyes. Something had already cracked. And the hardest part was still coming. From a technical standpoint, the moment was flawless. The timing, the lighting, the alignment of sound and image. Everything worked exactly as planned, but none of that mattered to Brian once he lifted his eyes. Because this wasn't about precision, it was about presence. Freddie smiled, that familiar, knowing smile Brian had seen across studios and stages decades earlier. It wasn't exaggerated. It wasn't theatrical. It was soft, almost private. For a second, Brian forgot the scale of the arena. He forgot the cameras. He forgot the audience. All he felt was the strange pull of something unfinished, a conversation paused too long ago. As the projection moved closer, Freddie's hands slowly lifted toward him. Brian had rehearsed this. He knew the cue. He knew the timing. But knowing didn't help. His fingers hesitated on the strings. His breath caught. The space between them felt charged, as if memory itself were testing him, asking whether he was ready to reach back. The arena remained silent. No singing, no cheering. Just thousands of people watching a man wrestle with a moment he never expected to face in public. Brian's hand began to rise, trembling slightly, not in performance, in uncertainty. And when his fingertips met the light, his composure finally gave way. His head dipped, his shoulders folded inward, tears surfaced before he could stop them. In that instant, the illusion didn't matter. What mattered was this. For one impossible moment, it felt like Freddie had reached back. And Brian couldn't hold himself together. Brian had known this second was coming. He had practiced it in silence, under neutral lights, telling himself it was only a cue, a beat in the song, a visual moment, nothing more. But standing there, with the arena holding its breath, theory collapsed into feeling. Freddie's hand hovered in front of him. Not close enough to touch, not far enough to ignore. Brian felt an unexpected hesitation ripple through his body. It wasn't fear. It was restraint, the instinctive pause of someone who knows that once they cross a line, there's no way back to how things were before. He lifted his hand slowly. The motion felt heavier than it should have, as if memory itself carried weight. The crowd watched in absolute stillness. No phones, no shouting. Just thousands of people witnessing something fragile unfold in real time. When Brian's fingertips met the light, the illusion should have broken. Instead, something inside him did. His breath caught, his jaw tightened. The years he'd spent keeping composure on stage dissolved in a single, unguarded moment. He bowed his head, shoulders curling inward as emotion finally slipped past the armor he'd worn for decades. This wasn't a performance anymore. It was grief, surfacing raw, unplanned, undeniable. And the arena understood instantly. No one cheered. No one moved. Because everyone knew they were watching a private moment that had never been meant for an audience. As the music faded, Brian didn't lift his head. For a brief, aching second, there was nothing but silence, the kind that feels too full to interrupt. Then, softly, almost tentatively, a voice rose from somewhere in the crowd. Then another. Then hundreds more. The audience began to sing. Not loudly, not triumphantly, but gently, as if afraid to break the moment. The words drifted upward, uneven and imperfect, carried by emotion rather than rhythm. Love of my life, don't leave me. Brian stood still, stunned. He hadn't planned this. No cue had prepared him for it. The song was no longer his to guide, it belonged to the room. 20,000 people sang not to Brian, but for Freddie. The effect was overwhelming. Strangers reached for each other. Tears ran openly. Some people lowered their phones, suddenly aware that filming felt wrong, like interrupting a conversation they weren't meant to overhear. Brian finally looked out at the crowd. And in that sound, that imperfect, human chorus, he heard something he hadn't heard in years. Not absence. Presence. The audience wasn't replacing Freddie. They were carrying him. And for the first time, Brian didn't feel alone on that stage. The grief that had weighed on him for decades shifted, not disappearing, but transforming into something shared. Something lighter. For years, Brian avoided moments like this. Not because he didn't love Freddie, but because loving him openly still hurt. Loss had become something private, carefully contained, managed through music and distance. It was easier that way. But this night dismantled that distance. Standing in front of the crowd, listening to thousands of voices echo a song born from something deeply personal, Brian understood why this moment had been unavoidable. It wasn't about tribute. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about release. He had carried unfinished conversations for decades, words never spoken, gratitude never fully expressed, anger, love, admiration, all tangled together with no place to go. This was the place. By allowing Freddie to appear, Brian wasn't reopening a wound. He was letting it breathe. The projection faded. The light softened. But something inside Brian remained changed. The weight didn't vanish. Grief doesn't work that way. But it loosened. It no longer pressed so tightly against his chest. Because for the first time, he realized something essential. He had never been grieving alone. Every person in that arena carried their own version of Freddie, a memory, a song, a moment that mattered. And by sharing that silence, then that song, they gave Brian something he hadn't known he needed: permission to let go just a little. And that made all the difference. When the lights finally shifted and the show moved on, something invisible stayed behind in that arena. Freddie hadn't returned. Time hadn't rewound. Nothing supernatural had happened. And yet, something very real had changed. What unfolded on that stage wasn't about technology or nostalgia. It was about what happens when memory meets courage. When someone stops protecting themselves from grief long enough to let it be seen. For Brian, that moment wasn't a performance highlight. It was a reckoning. A quiet acknowledgement that love doesn't end when someone is gone, it simply changes shape. Sometimes it hides in songs. Sometimes it lives in silence. And sometimes, when you least expect it, it reaches back through thousands of voices and reminds you that you're not alone. The arena fell silent not because people were shocked, but because they understood. They recognized the weight of that second, the honesty of it, the vulnerability of a man who had spent decades being strong, finally allowing himself to break. That's why this moment still resonates. Not because Freddie appeared, but because Brian finally let go of pretending he was okay. And in doing so, he gave everyone watching permission to feel something they'd been holding in too. Some music entertains. Some music comforts. And some moments, just once in a lifetime, heal. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments what song still makes you feel someone who's no longer here. Tap like if you believe music carries more than sound. And subscribe if you want more stories where Queen and Freddie Mercury are remembered not as legends, but as human beings. Because the most powerful moments in music are the ones that stay with us after the sound fades.